Welcome, everybody, to another day of the Dabrowski Congress. I'm Emma Nicholson, and with me is Sergej van Middendorp and Abbie VanMeter from the CMM Institute. Guys, did you want to introduce yourself briefly before we start the video?
Sure. Abbie, you want to start?
Sure, we do have a little introduction to ourselves in the video. I'm trying to think back to what we said so I don't repeat ourselves. But yeah, we both work with the CMM Institute and the theory of CMM, so you will hear all about that. And if you have any familiarity with us, it would be from Chris and Emma's podcast, or also Chris and Emma were on my podcast. So that's kind of the impetus for the rest of these conversations we've been having.
Yeah, my name is Sergej van Middendorp. With Abbie, I work with the CMM Institute. I'm in the Netherlands. I also don't want to repeat myself because I do know, but as Abbie, don't exactly remember how we introduce ourselves in the video we're just going to watch. So I'll keep it short. Our video is not that long because we wanted to give ample time for a conversation with the participants. So thanks for participating. Did we want ask that question before we start the video, Abbie, that we talked about on the email, or do you want to do that after?
Let's have that be the beginning of our dialogue time.
Great, let's do that. In that case, we're all set, Emma, for the video, I think.
VanMeter, and this is Sergej van Middendorp, and we're so thrilled to be here with you virtually today to learn together and to co-create what we hope will be something very meaningful for all of us. Sergej and I work with a communication theory called Coordinated Management of Meaning, and we'll call that CMM for short. And here I'll give credit to Sergej for being the one who kind of discovered the theory of positive disintegration in our community, at least brought that to our attention. And from there, we've been able to kind of build out this rich relationship that we see between TPD and our theory, CMM. I'm thinking that you may already have a little familiarity with what we're going to talk about today. If you've listened to any of a few podcasts, first, I host a podcast called Stories Lived, Stories Told. And I had the pleasure of having the host of this Congress, Chris Wells and Emma Nicholson, on for 2 episodes in 2023. And that was originally where this kind of conversation really started. And if you haven't found your way to my podcast yet, more likely, I am hoping that you have heard Sergej and I as guests on Chris and Emma's podcast, the Positive Disintegration podcast, just last month, where we continued the conversation. If you haven't listened to any of those episodes, no worries, we're going to cover it all today, but I point those out so that you can listen to those for a follow-up to this if you are interested in learning more and getting a little more context for this conversation too. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sergej to further introduce our presentation and what we hope for our time together today.
Yeah, thank you, Abbie. Well, like the Dabrowski Center exists to promote the theory of positive disintegration in the world, we both work with the CMM Institute, and that has the same purpose for CMM. And we want to talk about our organization for a moment. The full name of it is the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. And the goal of CMM is to help us make better social worlds. Now, we feel that this language is a great place to start, as this represents the shared mission of both CMM and TPD, as well as how we see them intersecting. So where TPD helps a self to become authentic and grow towards a personality ideal, CMM helps us communicate authentically and grow towards social ideals. So one way of conceiving of social ideals is that these are embodied in values. So once a person develops a hierarchy of values, from a TPD perspective, CMM may be helpful with enacting these values in the unfolding story together with others in the moment. What a better social world is, however, is different in each moment. So in order to make things better, we need to be able to improvise with our values as a guideline, if you will, and with whatever presents itself in the here and now. CMM helps us with a rich language for how we make meaning in each moment. And it supports improvising with our values in the context of how to make a situation better. It supports the flexibility we need, not only for the evolving self, but also for and with the others participating in that moment, and with the unfolding story itself as we make it. Now we will share a bit more about CMM and how we see CMM and the theory of positive disintegration relating as part of this presentation. And if you are watching this as a recording, well, as you are watching this as a recording, and we hope that you are participating in the dialogue at the Dabrowski Congress, we encourage you to make notes of whatever resonates with you or strikes you, and to develop some questions that you want to bring into our conversation later when we meet live.
Okay, so taking it from there, before I get deep into explaining CMM to you, and then Sergej's going to take the turn to make the connection to TPD, first, we want to talk about communication more broadly, thinking about what it is, how we think about it, and also how we do it. Okay, so the first question, what is communication? This may be a question you've never asked yourself before. Communication is one of those things that I think is really easy to take for granted. It's still widely understood in a pretty simple and vague kind of way. But CMM and we believe that communication is a lot more than simply what is said or the content, which kind of refers to the understanding of communication that exists, which is, kind of person A speaks at person B, and that's the communication. It's a lot more than that. And that's what we want to talk about today, because communication is the foremost social function of our lives. So yes, communication is what we say. It's also how we say it. But I also want to challenge us to expand our understanding to include more things like how we listen, how we show up to each other, the kind of environments that we create in our relationships, the context that we exist in and are speaking into, and the stories and patterns that we carry with us. You may be picking up that communication is an incredibly expansive term, and I think it should be. To me, everything is and can be communication. For example, the words we say can communicate what we think. The actions we take or the body language we use can communicate our feelings. But also beyond that, the way we spend our time communicates what we prioritize, and the way we spend our money communicates what we value or what we want and need. So everything can be a form of communication in our eyes. And for us, this is all about taking communication, which, like I said, is this thing that has kind of been thought to be abstract and intangible, and we want to make it something solid to grasp onto. So in CMM-ish language, we would call this move looking at communication instead of through it. So that's what CMM is kind of asking us to do. And this is kind of a step one, as how I think of it, of building awareness. And we're building awareness around something that you may not have been present to or attentive to before. And then if step one is the awareness, then step two to me is about what we do with that awareness. And that is where CMM comes in. So yes, CMM again is coordinated management of meaning. And it began as a communication theory. And truly all of our work is rooted in the theory of CMM. But more and more, we are understanding CMM as a practice or as a way of being or engaging with the world. So for a little history, CMM was created by Vernon Cronin and Barnett Pierce in the late 1970s. And the theory's main claim is this: persons in conversation co-construct their own social realities and are simultaneously shaped by the worlds they create. I'm going to take a second to break that down to make sure we all understand what that means. So first, persons in conversation refers to all of us. There's nothing we have to do to be persons in conversation. We really just are, because we all live in conversation, so to speak. And that means that we're all active participants. It means that we have choices and we have influence over the creation of our social worlds. And then that next piece, that co-constructing piece, that refers to the collaborative nature of building social worlds through communication. So like I said, we exist in conversation, we exist in relationship with others. And then that last part acknowledges that while yes, we are able to shape our social worlds, we also have to recognize the way in which our social worlds shape us in return. So That's referring to the way we internalize stories, the way that we make certain meaning based on the social world we inhabit. So persons in conversation co-construct their own social realities and are simultaneously shaped by the worlds they create. Translation, we're all active participants in life, and we get to make choices about how we communicate, and that will shape our social worlds. So now moving on to the question of how do we think about communication? One of the core concepts that underscores everything I've already explained about CMM is this relationship between stories and meaning making, and also seeing ourselves as the meaning making creatures. So how I think about it is that the way we communicate is through stories, and then what's going on in storytelling is meaning making. And CMM would say that no meaning is innate. So it's the stories we tell where we are actually the ones to make meaning of our experiences, things that happen to us, or things that we witness in the world. One good example is that we are all participating in this Congress right now, but we will walk away having made different meanings, even if we participated in the same workshop and attended the same presentations. And I'll take a moment to share here that this is what really drew me to CMM in the first place. I grew up with a really simple view of the world, and it was never really modeled to me, or I never considered that I could question the meaning behind what I encountered. I just wasn't taught to do that. So it felt really kind of revolutionary to learn about the social constructionist perspective, where I get to ask questions, reflect, decide if the meaning that has been made is something that I agree with. And importantly, if that doesn't work for me, realize that I have the ability to attach new meaning there. So that's the part that feels really empowering to me, of that personal choice and ability to play into the creation of those social worlds. And I'm going to pause here and turn it back over to Sergej for a second to share what his introduction to CMM was and what it means to him.
Yeah, thank you, Abbie. For me, it's about 15 years ago now, when I was a PhD student at Fielding Graduate University, developing my concept for my dissertation. And in this dissertation, I wanted to use the metaphor of organizational improvisation to better understand collaboration between different organizations. And I was in a meeting talking with my mentor about possible methods for my research. And he pointed out that I might consider CMM. And he shared that there was also a workshop on CMM in our university that very afternoon. So I planned to go there, and I learned that some of my fellow students were also meeting with Barnett Pearce, one of the scholars Abbie just mentioned, who is central to the theory. So I also joined their meeting, and I was touched by how deeply Barnett was really connecting with each of us, seeking his support. And later at the workshop, which was co-facilitated by several people from the community, I was struck by the practicality of the methods and the tools, which in my reflection of it offered what I saw as a musical notation for improvised communication and collaboration. And I could use it immediately to make more sense of my life and work. So today, I'm still growing in how I use it in that way. And reflexive of itself, CMM keeps helping me shape my social worlds, and CMM helps keep shaping me. So back to you, Abbie.
Yeah, thanks, Sergej. Yeah, so finally, I want to talk about how we do communication in CMM. And there's 3 facets of CMM that kind of guide us in this doing of communication. At least that's how I think about it. And those 3 facets are a perspective, a set of practices, and a goal. So CMM offers us first a communication perspective, meaning that we center communication in how we think and act and make sense of the world. This is that looking at communication piece that I mentioned earlier. And this is how I use CMM in my podcast and in my own life. And to me, this is where CMM becomes really practical. The kind of visual I use when I explain this is to think of it like a pair of glasses. You put them on and you just wear them all the time, because you can really look at anything through a communication perspective lens and learn something new, or I think see something that you wouldn't have seen if you weren't looking through this lens that centers communication. So it's a perspective. It's also a set of practices. CMM has a number of models that are useful for deconstructing and reconstructing meaning in our lives, also understanding the stories that shape us and reflecting on patterns. And we will get into the models a little more in the dialogue portion of our time together. But one practice I do want to offer you right now is these 3 questions that we ask. And that is, how did this get made? What are we making now? And what can we do to make better social worlds? Next is the goal. CMM offers us the goal of what we call better social worlds, and truly the goal of everything within CMM. So reflecting on the patterns, of being thoughtful in our storytelling, of empowering us in our meaning making, all of this is for the purpose of moving us closer to those better social worlds. And Sergej mentioned this early on, that the better social world definition is kind of up for interpretation, up for each of us to reflect on and decide what that means to us. But I do think there's value in that, in if we can take the time to reflect on what a better social world looks like or feels like, or what it is or means to each of us, then that kind of gives you the opportunity to work backwards, saying that, you know, if this is the kind of social world we want to create, that can inform how we need to act, how we need to communicate, how we want to be in relationship with each other right now in order to make that social world. So like TPD, CMM is a really rich theory with a lot of moving parts that are interrelated. So this truly is just a little taste of CMM to get us started. But we will take the opportunity, like I said, in the dialogue portion to kind of expand on any of this and really hopefully relate it back to some of your own stories and experiences and help make it relevant. But the one thing I'll leave you with before Sergej takes the next turn in this presentation is that some language that we like to use, specifically when we're talking about CMM as a way of being, is we talk about being CMM-ish. So that's just a good adjective. You know, you as a person can be CMM-ish, your practices can be CMM-ish, your way of being can be CMM-ish. So that encompasses how really expansive the theory is, has been and still is, that it started as a theory and has become a practice and is continuing to emerge in all of our lives as we practice it. So as we move on to the next part of this presentation, I just really invite you to start thinking about what it looks like for you to be, to act, and to communicate in a CMM-ish way.
Great. So then the question, how can we explore the similarities and the differences between TPD and CMM to see how they can strengthen each other, and also how we as communities can strengthen each other? So what emerges from what we've shared is that key similarities between both CMM and TPD are that they take a complex and developmental perspective on the concept of self, the focus of TPD, and selves, the focus of CMM. There also seems to be a strong shared focus on ethics. For example, TPD has a hierarchy of values as a concept that is important for higher levels of development. And CMM has the goal of making better social worlds. So that are, if you wish, points of connection between the theories that are very strong and shared. The key difference that we see is that the TPD seems to take the development of the self as its central goal, while CMM focuses on the broader context of the making of our social worlds. So the theories combined actually can take on a more expansive perspective than each theory on its own. How would it work? We think that CMM can complement TPD by offering this communication perspective and the concepts and the tools to explore this broader context of social evolution from the perspective of the evolving self. TPD, in turn, can complement CMM by offering a collection of coherent concepts and analytical constructs, like the overexcitabilities and the dynamisms, for example, to deepen our interpretation of the evolving self in the context of the social worlds they are making. So the theories together span a broader perspective, but TPD specifically adds more depth of language, we think, to the evolution of the concept of self, which in turn is one of the key concepts also in CMM. Well, as Abbie mentioned earlier, CMM has several models and tools to practically look at communication, and we'll show some of those tools as I give examples. These tools can be used, for example, in TPD to visualize, describe, and interpret episodes of disintegration. But now we look at them as a communicative process. So understanding the levels of disintegration, each with their different set of dynamisms, for example, can be seen as analogous to the CMM tool, which we call forms of communication, where each form of communication gives expression to our experience from a different worldview, if you will, where worldviews may be analogous to levels in the theory of positive disintegration. So that's one way to take a tool from CMM, apply it to the theory of positive disintegration. Another thing that we could think about is the dynamisms. So the dynamism, which we could be seen through the CMM tool of logical forces, as forces that shape how a person acts into a context, or how a context of relationships and cultures, including the dynamisms going on there, shape their response in a conversation. We'll share an overview of these tools as we follow up on our presentation today, and we invite you to try them out and get in touch with us to further explore how we can join forces. And if you want, of course, we can also go into them further in the dialogue after our presentation today. So then, having said all that, I'll hand it back to Abbie to make the transition.
Okay, yes. So in the true spirit of CMM, and for the sake of improvisation, like we promised in the title of this presentation, we're now going to turn it over to ourselves now, but live, to engage in dialogue together. So you can ask questions and we can tease out more of what we've shared today. And importantly for us, co-create some more meaningful connections between what we've shared and your own stories. So thank you, and we'll see you on Zoom.
So yes, please, everyone, feel free to questions into the chat or to indicate that you'd like to have Sergej turn your mic on and have a little chat with you guys. Thanks very much for that presentation. And to the both of you, I have really appreciated, particularly over the course of doing our podcast together, learning to understand CMM better, particularly when we talk about positive disintegration and how we behave towards others in relation to our values. For me, CMM offers a way to do that. So, when you're talking about behaviors, it's not just what you do physically, it's, how you talk to people in those relationships. And Chris and I often say that, your values don't happen in a bubble, and neither does your development under theory of positive disintegration. It's all about how you're interacting with other people. So I've really appreciated the times we've been able to spend together and getting my head around CMM.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, Emma. I think the experience has been the same for us, that knowing about TPD has also added value to us in our lives and our understanding of CMM as well. So yeah, if people have questions, you can put them in the chat. But like we said, being communicators, hoping for this to be a dialogue time, please feel free to raise your hand and speak out loud if you feel comfortable doing that. To get us started in a session that happened yesterday in Denver with Mike and Tosh, I asked them the question of what about TPD initially hooked them or resonated with them right off the bat. I spoke a little bit in this presentation about my experience with CMM is that it was that meaning-making piece. Mike and Tosh shared their different answers, but I thought that would be an interesting question to start us off with. And maybe that's just a one-word answer in the chat, or maybe people have more that they want to say. But yeah, what is it about TPD that originally hooked you or resonated with you about the theory? And that might be a good place to start as, if nothing else, a way to demonstrate the different meaning that we make, that we can all look at the same theory, but relate to it in very different ways.
I also have the Slido open if anyone wants to question there, but I think we have someone to ask a question.
Ineke, go ahead.
No, not really a question, but you asked what was the first thing that gripped you about the theory. And I was at a workshop from Lotte van Lith, and she was talking about the theory. And it was, I really cannot explain it. It was sort of homecoming. I was crying the whole time when she was talking about it. And I was really just kind of recognition in my soul or something that was what I was experiencing my whole life, but never knew the words to it and never knew what it was. And it was, for me, it was a sort of homecoming. And later on, when I read more and talked about it more, it was really like, yeah, I felt I can understand myself much better now. And now I also understand my children better because they also, yeah, I can see a lot of me in them, but I also see a lot of my deceased father in them and also in me. And I can really, yeah, it makes sense now. So, and it's really difficult to explain. It's just a feeling.
I'm really glad you used that word homecoming, and I would venture a guess that that's a lot of people's experiences. That resonates with me about my experience. I call it kind of a recognition or a knowing,
Yeah.
not necessarily that I'm being told something brand new, but I'm already recognizing it to be true. The only difference is that I'm gaining new language. And so I think that that is true for a lot of people with TPD, and I'll throw CMM in there as well, that's that meaning making piece, is that you're not necessarily experiencing something new. Maybe you've always been experiencing the same thing, but you're able to tell a different story about it. That's what CMM would say. Be able to put new meaning to it when you have better language to describe what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
I also recognize that I found TPD also through Lotte, and in my case through a web page on her website which advertised the course she was giving. And when I read her page, it immediately made sense to me, and I knew I just had to go to that course. Intuitively, there wasn't much thought involved there. It just struck right away. And I think intuition and recognizing something for what it is, yeah, are in meaning close to each other for me. So thanks for sharing that, Ineke. It's a similar experience.
Yeah. Thank you.
We've got a couple of comments in the chat. Ryan said that making sense of things that weren't making sense without TPD. I guess that was in relation to your question, Abbie. And Susanna said, no question, just enjoying this. Someone's got a graduate degree in communication and appreciating the emphasis on social construction of reality, meaning and identity. Reminded that one scholar said Homo sapiens would be more aptly named Homo narrans, because what may really differentiate us from the other species, as far as we know, is not intelligence per se, the way we co-create meaning through stories, which seems to be right on the money.
Yeah.
For CMM.
Yes. Yeah. Sergej, you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, thanks for reflecting that back to us, Susanna. I often think about what differentiates us, if we can say that at all, by the way, from our perspectives as human beings, from other living beings. But in as far as we have something to say about it, I really resonate with what you're saying here. And also, I would say all other forms of expression, as CMM takes a bit of a broader perspective around the storytelling, like music making, dancing, the art, I think, of co-creating meaning together. Thank you.
I'll add here too that Rachel's presentation yesterday really jumped out at me. Another example of recognition, because she used a lot of language that we would use as well about emergence and meaning making and co-creating. And so I think just to help contextualize a little bit about what we hope we're offering you here, is that we're saying, we don't think we're coming in here with anything new necessarily. I think a lot of you are already learning this language, but what we're offering that's additional is, here's the larger framework. You have all this, you know, these words that you're using, and CMM is also using them. So it's kind of like you have the puzzle pieces, but maybe didn't know that they created a larger picture. And CMM is kind of that larger puzzle that can be created when you start to think about the relationship between storytelling and meaning making. And yeah, so that's how like CMM has been very helpful to me. Looks like we have another hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Thank you for hosting this session. Communication is obviously extremely important, and I was just wondering if CMM can help someone who is neurodivergent or gifted communicate better with those who are not.
That's a great question, and really starts getting at our claim that there is something for both perspectives to combine and strengthen each other. So I know that CMM has been applied over the course of the past decades to very different subjects. It has been applied in family therapy, where I remember several cases being described of neurodivergent children in the context of their families working through issues together, where a systemic approach was used. So there's quite some literature on that. And I have an example from our own life in our family, where both our kids could use CMM quite quickly in a very practical way when we shifted their focus when they were fighting for each other, with each other, for example, which they did a lot given all their challenges. And then in the past we used to ask, what are you doing? And then they would say, we got into a fight. And then we said, okay, but was that what you wanted to make? A very simple intervention from a CMM perspective. And then they would sort of be put off kilter for a bit and say, what are you saying? We were trying to make fun, or we were trying to make a game together, or okay, so why are you making a fight then if you want to make fun together? And repeating that several times started shifting their language, and the language, I think, non-consciously helped them understand that a fight is not something you just get, it's something you also make. Or you could also look at it as something you are making. So there's very simple interventions that CMM could offer in this case, which is a simple family situation, but that was very powerful for our family. And we also get it reflected back as parents. So when we do something, then our kids later would ask, what were you trying to make? Is this how you make that? Are there maybe better ways to making that? So these are just some ideas from my experience. Is that what you're asking, Erica, or?
Yes, of course, not everyone is as receptive to those types of conversations. And that's also a part of communication, figuring out how to bridge those gaps. And that's an area that can be difficult.
Absolutely, yeah. I would say every situation is unique, and every relationship as well. And if there's more specific patterns of communication needed that you have to make up that aren't readily available, the tools themselves might help you sort of construct them, or are ways to try out several new things and see how they work. So yeah, I would invite you to try some of them out and share it with us, or to keep in conversation after the presentation, and we might point you to some of the things in our toolkit.
Yeah, I like Sergej's story is a great example of what we talked about in the presentation, that CMM is offering us a communication perspective. It's a lens, it's a way of being different than what, can rub me the wrong way sometimes when people are trying to peddle, communication skills that kind of read as very like shallow things or just a checklist. We'll do this and then you're a good communicator. But what
Right.
we're offering, like Sergej is saying, is this perspective. And another words that we use for that is an improvisational toolbox, is that communication is improvisation. It is unexpected. And that's that coordinating part of coordinated management and meaning that you're talking about, Erica, is that we are in relationship and you have to coordinate, you have to collaborate with other people and you can't control them. So you can only control how you're showing up. And so Sergej works a lot with improvisational jazz as a metaphor. Other people in our community do as well, are talking about like improvisational comedy. And the distinction that's been really meaningful for me that people in our community have made is that improvisation, don't mishear that to be winging it. That people who study improvisation know you are actually so prepared and have such a good understanding of different musical things or different comedy things and timing that you can improvise and maybe look like you're winging it. So that's kind of what CMM offers from my perspective, is that background knowledge, these tools that are in your back pocket, like asking the question of what are you making or what did you want to make, is we don't know exactly what situation you're speaking into, and reactions could be unexpected from the people you're coordinating with, but you know that you can pull out this thing from your toolbox of the lens of talking about meaning making and storytelling and patterns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely like to know more and maybe do some, what would be the word, but giving an example and getting some feedback on how that conversation could be more successful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Okay, I see we have another question in the chat. Emma, am I stepping on your toes if I read this aloud?
No, go for it. Step away.
All right. Okay. Michael said, I'm new to both theories. I'm curious whether TPD and CMM would believe in a true or core self, or would it better be understood through an existential emptiness of the soul in which self and social relatedness are fundamentally constructed? Apologies if this question is not directly related to the current discussion, but I'm curious about your thoughts on this. I think it's definitely related, Michael. So no worries. Do you have more you would want to say on that question, or should we add some turns now?
Yeah, I guess I come more from an existential philosophy background. So thinking about, being in nothingness, if any sort of those kind of philosophers, Kierkegaard or Sartre, are kind of related, if you have comments on them. But yeah, ultimately, whether there is something core and innate in us, or if we are kind of stuck trying to form our connections without any sort of grounding, or where would you start grounding yourself in both your own self-concept as well as in relation with others?
I have some thoughts on the CMM perspective. Sergej, you okay if I start, or you have something you'd like to start us off with?
No, please start, Abbie, and I have some things to add to later. Yeah, great.
Right. Yeah, Michael, kind of picking up on this true self that you mentioned in the comment in the chat. From the CMM perspective, or my understanding of the CMM perspective, which is rooted in social constructionism, is that there's not a capital T truth out there in the world that already exists for us to find. It is what we call in the communication world pluralistic truths, or the idea that multiple stories can exist at the same time. And that would be distinctly little t on truths, that my truth or my story might look very different than Emma's truth and story, but they can coexist at the same time. And again, it's not necessarily something that already exists out there that I have to find or crack the code on. It's something that I get to create. What is true for me? What do things mean for me? What is the story for me? Are all things that I am constructing. So I feel that maybe TPD has a slightly different perspective on that, about coming to find the true self kind of under all the mess and pushing things aside, but I won't speak for that. That's just my initial thoughts from the CMM perspective. And so there is a little bit, I think, true in what you're saying of the nothingness of it, is that there's, the meaning is not innate. And so one of the, silly but great examples of that is like, at least in the United States, I don't know how it is in other countries, but the way that we've gendered colors, that blue is a boy color and pink is a girl color, that's one of those like, well, what does that actually mean? But we take it for granted that we've attached that meaning. And so you could say nothing means anything until we make it mean something.
Yeah, thanks, Abbie. And a few additions there from the history of CMM itself that didn't appear out of nothing and also built on earlier work. For example, of Wittgenstein was one of the influences with his language games and his later thinking that language defined the limits of our world. So it's rooted in that linguistic philosophy, also in pragmatics. So how do we make things happen in communication? How do we construct a social world? So John Dewey, for example, American educational philosopher, was a major influence on Barnett Peirce and Vernon Cronin. And from phenomenology, especially the social phenomenology of Alfred Schutz and later Berger and Luhmann, who wrote this book, The Social Construction of Reality. I think we mentioned that a few times. And in its history, it's also had several phases. So it started as a theory to mostly describe communication. So it was more positivistic at that time, but with the intent to hermeneutically really understand what was going on in the communication. And later it became more interpretive. And over the past, say few decades, it's really become more practical. So applied in very different contexts, like conflict resolution, education, therapy, etc., organization. I don't recall in my reading of the theory any direct references to existential philosophy, but I could look that up and let you know later. I'd be interested myself to learn more about any relationships they made in that respect. So thanks for that question.
May I at this point offer a TPD perspective as well?
I was hoping you would.
I'm the most nervous about answering this than I've ever been about answering any positive disintegration question. This is like super in the weeds, expert level stuff. So if I go missing later, it is because Chris has killed me. No, I'm just kidding. The answer from a TPD perspective is literally both. So I believe Dabrowski called it something like the essential compound, but he literally believed in a combination between an essence, which he got from philosophers like Plato, and existentialism, which, because he read Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. So he did believe, yes, in a core or an essence, because he also believed that part of disintegration was sort of rediscovering these like universal sort of values that were within humanity. But again, from an existential perspective, you've got the third factor and our ability to make choices. And that the third factor was a big driver in our development. So choosing for ourselves. So if you want to think about the first factor as almost like nature, so, your biology and things like that. Second factor is nurture, your environment. And when we talk about second factor as a dynamism, it's like those social roles and social scripts that influence. And then you've got the third factor as the individual's choice of how they're going to drive their own development. So that was a big part. So yeah, literally, like the taco girl says, why not both?
Yeah, great, Emma. That's when we would ask Barnett Peirce questions like this, he would always give an answer, and then he would say, "And."
Never but, always and.
Always and, yes.
I hope that answered the question somewhat, Michael.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much. I do have one quick follow-up. First of all, thank you for all the references. I'm very intrigued to research them further. Actually, Sergey, would you be able or someone able to write some of those names that you mentioned in the chat? I'd love to dig deeper. The only one that I recalled was Wittgenstein, and I've yet to explore his latter philosophy, but would love to explore. But I guess to Abbie, I'm curious. I appreciate a sort of like social relativism, perhaps, to that communication style. But I'm curious about, how, you mentioned like why not stories that can coexist. And I'm just thinking about those difficult situations where stories can't coexist, or it would be complicated to reach a certain resolution. And of course, presently in the world, I'm thinking about, this Palestinian-Israeli conflict or Russia-Ukraine, where there's clearly two narratives out there in the world that simply can't be completely heard and appreciated fully without stepping on the toes of the other, or even in an American context, the right and the left, the current seemingly greater and greater divide that we're seeing in the political landscape. I'm curious about what CNM would advise for at least a first step towards resolving the communication issues. Of course, those larger socio-political issues are much greater in scale and scope. But from a communication perspective, how can stories that seemingly can't coexist, how can we bring them to acknowledge each other at least?
Yeah, that's the question. That's a great question. And I'm thankful that you give me the chance to be very explicit and say, yes, don't mishear me to say that any of this is easy, that coexisting stories happen peacefully. It's not to say that like TPD, like disintegrating, living out CMM, creating better social worlds, coordinating with others is challenging to do for, many reasons. And so I guess where I'd want to start in answering your question is to look at dialogue. We called this portion of our time dialogue, and that's a word that I want that to evoke a very specific meaning when we hear that in the context of CMM, because the definition we would use is that to be in dialogue with each other is to exist in the tension of both holding your own ground or holding space for your own stories to be true, while also being profoundly open to the other. And like the examples you're giving of great conflict between groups, that not necessarily to say that you endorse or think it's okay what the other group is doing. But again, using a lens of stories is the length that I'll go to say is at least a step one in, I don't know if that, is something that can reconcile, but at least takes away that assumption that someone here is right, someone here is wrong, things are the way they are. If you can start to say, okay, well, what's the story I'm telling? And again, talking about things as a story or talking about meaning as constructed is not to take away the value of it or the weight of it or the importance of it or the realness of it. It's just helpful to understand how it was actually constructed. So if I'm thinking about my position, what are the stories that led me there? Or if I'm trying to consider someone who has different beliefs than I do, kind of looking at the humanity as a first place to say, what's the story? What's the meanings? What's the experiences that this person has had to lead them to where they are? And so I think that, as again, step one by no means is that the answer, the solution to everything. But as a step one to say, I'm over here and you're over here, that tension, being in that tension that is dialogue, is really uncomfortable. And so I think that is the route to how do you become comfortable in the discomfort, or how do you learn to lean into the discomfort, again, as like a very first step that I feel it's necessary to say these things because we're not doing them like you've talked about. We're very polarized. People really don't know how to communicate with each other across boundaries or across really great differences. But that's where I'll start for now. Sergej or even Emma, things that you would add to that?
Yeah, at least one. That thanks, Abbie, by the way, for that. I think that's the foundation. There's been quite some work done in the community on conflict resolution, and I shared a link to publications on our website where there's different these are ordered by different topics. One of them is conflict management, and you can see quite a few publications there. It's been applied in Colombia, for example, in practice, and our fellow board member Beth Fisher-Yoshida is the director of an institute at Columbia University in New York, where they also study conflict and negotiation and how to approach these difficult subjects from this perspective. If you want to learn more, go check that out. I did notice the question by Hoyun, I hope I pronounce your name right, about resources for younger people. And Abbie shared a link to the Cosmo activities. Maybe you want to say a few words about that, Abbie, also for people who cannot see the chat?
Yeah, great point. Yes, so asked about activities maybe related to young people or oriented towards young people. And so, yes, conveniently, we actually do have those. And so Cosmo Kids, Cosmo Tweens, and now Cosmo Teens are part of our Cosmo Activities line. And these are all social emotional resources that are available for free at the link that I shared. And those are, I would say, less teaching about what CMM is, but like we've talked about how we really use it is using a CMM-ish perspective, using a communication perspective to help children or young people in the different cases of the different resources understand their role in creating the social world. Like I said, for me and my relationship to the theory, and I think a lot of people, that's really a key part, is that before you can embody a communication perspective, before you can make better social worlds, you really have to believe that you are an active participant, a curious participant in the world, and that you have power to do things. And so kind of the idea behind this is that, well, if we had kids that from a very young age were taught different ways of making meaning and different ways of engaging with each other, finding shared language, talking about what you're making, like Sergej talked about with his kids, or in a school setting, like Cosmo Activities talks about, then, what kind of adults are they going to grow up to be? What kind of social worlds could we create if we have, generations that are rooted in this? So yeah, bunch of different activities on there. They're available in a couple different languages, and we're working on doing more translations for Cosmo Kids right now. And again, we're very interested in collaboration and building relationships as much as possible. So for anyone who's wanting to use those, we're happy to support with, virtual training sessions, or we have some physical copies as well that we're looking to donate of the activities. So yeah, other exciting things is that we're developing Cosmo Parents right now. So that'll be the next turn, hoping to give parents an improvisational toolbox of activities. There's my podcast, and I'll add a link in the chat too, that we have a Substack now, and that's really kind of a home for all of our resources. The podcast I make, there's some short videos, some infographics. You saw 2 of them in our presentation that we recorded. So yeah, for people that are curious and want to learn more and see value here, that's the place I'd point you to, that Substack, and I will include the link in the chat. Or yeah, Sergej and I maybe can even put our emails in the chat, that we're happy to be conversation partners and helping people see how CMM could emerge in their lives.
Great. I think we're nearing the end of our time together.
Yeah, someone just said didn't know about the CMM Institute before. Yeah, definitely go to the website and check it out. Watching Abbie's little video graphic in the resources really helped me wrap my head around some of the tools, and also drew out a lot of connections for me between positive disintegration and CMM and how it could fit. So thank you both very much. Did you want to add any final thoughts before we close this one out?
Well, one from my side is about this recognition or this intuition that when you come into a context of both knowledge, but also the people, that this just is right, or that this just works. And I've experienced it with both TPD and CMM, and I'm really hoping that we can see this as a further step of an ongoing conversation. So I would really be interested also to further explore those relationships between the 2 theories, the practices, and the communities. So thank you for the invitation to present and share our story here.
Yeah, I echo that. Thanks as well. And I think just the thing I would want to leave people with is that, especially I know a lot of people in this community come from the gifted community or neurodivergence, and I think that there is a lot of value that CMM can add in terms of the stories that we tell. I think that's been a thread through a lot of the presentations so far, is that many people who resonate with TPD have been told stories most of their lives that didn't resonate or didn't feel true in any kind of way, or felt belittling or limiting. And so I really think that the power of CMM and TPD also is the ability to relate to stories differently, and to again, adopt that personal power to tell a new story about yourself. And so I just hope for, all the empowerment and good energy for everybody to be able to kind of claim that for themselves and work towards authenticity, work towards alignment, work toward that personality ideal. And as we know, the theme of this Congress is living the theory. So I think we're kind of trying to present CMM as a means to an end in that way. CMM stands on its own really great, but it's also a great way to live out TPD is through CMM. So thank you so much for joining us for this presentation.
Amazing. I don't think anyone could have summed that up better, Abbie. Thanks for that.